Xiao Yuan's family wasn't originally from the neighborhood. He and his mother, a pale, hauntingly thin woman, moved into the house next door to my grandmother's. The previous family had left for somewhere else, renting the place to the two of them. Xiao Yuan's mother was peculiar. Regardless of the season, she always wore a faded floral blouse and thin brown pants. Every day, she would hold a handful of rice, calling out to her scrawny chickens that seemed even more emaciated than she was. She rarely spoke to the neighbors, living quietly, weaving bamboo items like brooms, hats, or rice baskets to sell for a little money to support herself and her son. Her face always held a look of unnameable sorrow, like someone hiding a secret illness or a child waiting to be scolded. Her skin was yellowish. Her chapped, bluish lips gave her a sickly appearance. Yet, whenever she saw Xiao Yuan return, a mix of loathing and fear flickered in her eyes, despite her outward gestures of care. Her voice was always low, muffled as if by a veil, or like a sound echoing up from deep underground. In the summer heat, it was like the fading rasp of a dying cicada. Though she kept to herself, at night you could sometimes hear her talking with her son. Mostly it was her voice alone, with Xiao Yuan rarely replying since he spent most of the day outside playing, only returning in the evening. A few times, I woke up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom and heard noises coming from their house. Curious, I quietly crouched by their window to listen in. But their conversations were strange, almost incomprehensible to me. "Just let me go," she would plead. "What more do you want from me? How long do you plan to stay with me? Won't you just leave?" she'd say, her voice laced with exasperation. And Xiao Yuan's response was always the same, a simple, firm no. I was curious about this odd mother and son, but at that age adults just saw us kids as meddlesome. Even if I mentioned it to my grandmother or my mother, all I'd get was a playful smack and a mild scolding before they went back to whatever they were doing. At 5 or 6, a child's mind is filled with question marks, curious about everything, and Xiao Yuan intrigued me. The area where my grandmother lived had originally been a dense forest. Over 100 years ago, near the end of the Qing dynasty, a group of fishermen came ashore and decided to settle here. The place came to be called Fuangjia Village. As for why it was named that, no one could really say. It was simply passed down from previous generations, like an old habit. There were so many kids in this neighborhood, a swarm of them, from 5 to 8 or 9 years old, so scenes of play were everywhere. Since most families here were of similar modest means, everyone's circumstances were about the same. Children from poor families seemed to naturally help each other, so it didn't take long for Xiao Yuan to settle in and get to know everyone. But there was something a little odd about him. Xiao Yuan had an unusually large head, and his features were odd, almost flat and unremarkable. From afar, he looked like a red balloon with a vaguely human face painted onto it. His skull was round and smooth, with thin, greasy strands of hair clinging to it. His scalp was so pale and thin that the veins beneath it stood out clearly, like purple straws. His eyes were small, with sparse eyelashes, making them look like tiny beans embedded in dough. Xiao Yuan's face was marked by a thick, perpetually downturned mouth, giving him a look as if he were always swallowing something bitter. Despite their poverty, his mother made sure Xiao Yuan had meat and fish every day. When they couldn't afford it, she'd wade into a nearby pond, catching frogs with her bare hands to cook for him, even if the toad's toxins left her hands red and raw. We kids were envious of Xiao Yuan for the care he received, and he had an unusual air of authority about him. He rarely spoke, but when he did, his tone was mature, almost scolding, and somehow we all obeyed him. Xiao Yuan's skin was often swollen and pale, almost translucent, like thin, wet pig skin. His hands were always damp. Holding his hand felt like clutching a slippery bar of soap. During hide-and-seek games, Xiao Yuan could always find us, no matter where we hid, under carts, in bamboo baskets, in dark closets, or up in trees. We'd think we'd found the perfect hiding spot, only to feel his heavy hand on our shoulder and hear his chilling words, "I see you." Although he was supposed to hide when he was caught, Xiao Yuan always preferred to seek, and we let him. But the game lost its fun when he won too often. Eventually, when he asked us to play, the others would give him dismissive looks and scatter, leaving only me behind. He would squint after them in silence as they walked away. "Why can you always find us?" I asked him one day as we walked home. "You're all too dumb. I've hidden in those spots so many times before," he replied, blunt as ever. I was used to it by then. "Then, is there a way to hide so no one can ever find you?" I asked as we reached his house. He was about to push the wooden door open when he stopped, turned, and stepped close to me with a sly grin. He extended his hands and gently placed his thumbs over my eyes. "Blind them," he whispered, pressing down. "Just like this. If you press hard enough, they won't be able to see you." His voice was cold and sharp as a drill, and the pressure on my eyes grew. Suddenly, my vision blurred, and a stinging pain shot through my eyes. I burst into tears, and Xiaoyuan quickly let go, hurrying inside, leaving me rubbing my sore eyes alone. That night, I struggled to fall asleep. My grandmother's and mother's usual lullabies faded into the background as Xiaoyuan's words echoed in my head. "Blind them." Such a strange boy, I thought, rolling over in bed. The air felt stiflingly hot, even though the night breeze should have been cool. Suddenly, a pressure in my lower body reminded me I had to go to the bathroom. Rubbing my still aching eyes, I climbed down from my bamboo bed and stumbled out into the night. As I mentioned before, the alleyways in Fuang Family Town were narrow and cramped. During the summer, the houses felt like steaming cages, with everyone dragging their beds and bamboo mats outside to escape the heat. My grandmother's house was right at the mouth of the alley, and none of the homes here had toilets. Adults would walk 100 meters to reach the public restroom, but for us kids, we made do by the drainage ditch nearby. Climbing off my bed that night, I noticed the moon had risen. I carefully maneuvered around the clutter and then saw the rows of neighbors sleeping outside. I hadn't paid much attention to them before, but that night, my sore eyes seemed to sharpen my vision. Stretching in a line down the alley, people lay outside each house, all completely still, like an assortment of goods stacked carelessly, the boundaries between them blurred. The silvery moonlight seeped through gaps in worn-out plastic tents, casting a strange sheen on their bare skin. They reminded me of the factory nearby that made plastic mannequins for clothing stores. I had seen them once, stacked in piles on the ground, their vacant eyes staring blankly, lifelike yet lifeless, just like what I was seeing now. But after I finished my business, I noticed something odd. Only Xiaoyuan's house didn't have anyone sleeping outside. In fact, since they'd moved in, no matter how unbearable the heat got, he and his mother never joined the others outside. They always shut their door early each night. Just as I was about to go closer to take a look, I heard a creak, and their door slowly swung open. A figure emerged, hunched as it slipped out, then straightened and closed the door quietly. I crouched by a bamboo stack and squinted to get a better look. It was Xiaoyuan's mother. Her face was turned toward me, brimming with an odd excitement and relief that she seemed barely able to contain, like a prisoner freshly released or a gambler anticipating a big win. She clutched a small cloth bag, the same one she'd brought when they'd first moved in. She gave a cautious glance back at the door, hesitating a moment, then carefully picked her way past the sleeping bodies in the alley. It wasn't easy, and she seemed to deliberate for a second before deciding to take the path closer to where I was hiding. She passed so near that I held my breath, but she didn't notice me, too focused on her escape. Just as I was puzzling over why she was sneaking off in the middle of the night, the door creaked open again. Xiaoyuan stepped out. His eyes weren't small and dull as they looked in the day. They shone with a strange gleam, like a cat's in the darkness. "She can't get away," he whispered, voice low and eerie, sounding far too mature like my grandfather's. "My favorite game is hide and seek." With that, he slid back into the house. A chill ran over me, sweeping away the oppressive heat. Rubbing my goosebumps, I climbed back into bed, feeling oddly afraid of Xiaoyuan for the first time. The next morning, still half asleep, I was woken up by my family to wash up and get ready for breakfast. As I groggily stumbled outside, I saw something strange. Tiểu Nguyên mother was bringing him a steaming bowl of noodles topped with a fried egg, placing it on the bench where he sat. Tiểu Nguyên looked down at the bowl with a smug grin and took it eagerly. Despite the steam rising from the noodles, he ate them in big gulps, seemingly immune to the heat. In no time, The bowl was empty. His mother watched him, her gaze filled with both resentment and resignation. She bit her lip and grabbed the empty bowl without saying a word. Tiểu Nguyên, now finished, darted outside, reminding me to eat quickly so we could go out and play together. I still felt uneasy about what had happened the night before. Maybe it had just been a dream, I tried to reassure myself. A few days passed and the summer heat finally began to fade. My time at Grandma's was drawing to an end. I counted the days and realized I only had one left. When Tiểu Nguyên heard I was leaving, he simply responded with an indifferent "oh," then gathered everyone to play hide and seek again. With no other games to play, the kids reluctantly joined him. As usual, Tiểu Nguyên caught every single one of us, relentlessly hunting us down the entire afternoon. I was no exception, and on the way home, my friends grumbled about his strange way of playing. That evening, everyone went to bed early. In the middle of the night, a sudden cold wind, sharp as a knife, blew through the alley. I lay in bed, blindly reaching around for my blanket, but my hand found something round, warm and solid instead, like a ball of flesh. Startled, I opened my eyes. Tiểu Nguyên was crouched right next to my bed, with his head directly under my hand. He stared at me, his eyes wide and nose flaring, a sight so chilling that it sent a shiver down my spine. I gasped, but he swiftly covered my mouth with his hand. "Follow me," he whispered, turning around and heading out the door. Like someone under a spell, I found myself trailing him into the night. The once bustling street was now silent and desolate. Back then, there were no late-night establishments, no bars, no internet cafes, and even televisions were a luxury that only a few households could afford. By this time of night, apart from the night watchman, not a soul could be found outside. The only sound was the echo of my footsteps and Tiểu Nguyên on the pavement, still warm from the day's sun. Ahead of me, Tiểu Nguyên walked at an unhurried pace. I had no idea how long we'd been walking, far enough to leave Phung Family Square behind, past the grain depot and the little general store. Where are we going anyway? I couldn't hold back from asking him. To find someone. She wanted to play hide and seek with me, he replied without turning around, his voice calm. Who are you looking for? I mumbled, but Tiểu Nguyên didn't answer. He only chuckled softly, his broad shoulders shaking as he moved forward. I watched, noticing how the skin on the back of his neck wrinkled like folds of old fabric. After what felt like forever, just as I was ready to collapse from exhaustion, I bumped into him. He had stopped in his tracks. "She knows she can't escape," he said, almost to himself. I was confused, but then I noticed he wasn't talking to me. He was speaking to a figure huddled in the shadows by the closed general store. "I'll follow you for the rest of my life," Tiểu Nguyên said, his voice carrying a hint of something dark. This was the crossing where the main road met the residential streets, with nobody around on either side. "Even so, I have to try," said the figure, straightening up and clutching a small bundle of clothes. It was Tiểu Nguyên mother. "You're leaving tomorrow, right?" Tiểu Nguyên suddenly turned to me with a faint smile. I nodded, feeling stunned. "You've been the kindest to me here," he said, reaching out like a grown-up, as if he wanted to pat my head. "What do you think you're doing?" His mother's voice shattered the quiet, sharp as nails on a chalkboard. Tiểu Nguyên hand froze in midair, and something in his posture sent a shiver through me. I felt a primal instinct to flee and moved to stand next to his mother, who instinctively pushed me behind her. "I'm sick of this body," he muttered, cradling his own head with both hands. "Why do you keep playing hide and seek with me? I've told you, you'll never win. No matter where you hide, I'll find you." He extended his arms toward us, that eerie smile spreading wider. "Run, hurry, don't let him find us," she shrieked, grabbing my hand and pulling me along the empty street. When I glanced back, Tiểu Nguyên was still standing there, his arm reaching out toward us. We dashed from one hiding spot to another, desperate to escape. But each time, before we could even catch our breath, Tiểu Nguyên would appear, emerging from the shadows as if he had been waiting all along. "I found you again! Quick, hide!" His mother seemed to lose control, yelling in terror as she dragged me away once more. I had no idea how long we ran. Exhausted, she finally slumped against an iron railing, panting heavily. Too tired to run anymore? Tiểu Nguyên face popped up between the gaps in the railing, grinning at us. "I won't run anymore," she screamed, grabbing him by the neck and pulling him to the ground. But he only kept smiling. "I've always been a simple vendor. I've never killed anyone. Never! But with you, I've had enough!" She spat, her fingers trembling with rage. "The first one?" He wheezed, his voice distorted, like a water pipe slowly draining. "Blinded. It won't find us," I muttered, the words escaping my mouth without thinking. She seemed to understand, her thumb moving toward Tiểu Nguyên eye sockets as if she'd found her answer. Tiểu Nguyên lay motionless on the ground, and the woman, barely able to move, used the last of her strength to drag me forward. She kept running, taunting me with cruel words. I glanced back, seeing Tiểu Nguyên still lying there, unmoving. Eventually, both of us were completely exhausted, collapsing on the ground, breathless. The woman's voice, however, seemed to regain some strength. "I just saved your life, kid," she said smugly, glancing back at me. "Isn't Tiểu Nguyên your son?" I gasped, still struggling to understand their strange relationship. "He's not my son." The woman's face twisted into an expression of hatred, her fists clenched tightly. "I thought he was just some object, but now I see he's like a stubborn bandage that can't be removed," she muttered, still angry. She turned to me, noticing the confusion in my eyes, and waved her hand dismissively. "Why am I even telling you all this? You wouldn't understand, you little brat," she grumbled, standing up and stretching her back. "You won't be seeing him again. Every day he plays hide and seek, that little bastard. I'll make sure you can't find him." Her lips curled into a sinister grin, and then, without warning, her eyes narrowed at me like a predator eyeing its prey. I instinctively took 2 steps back. "Come with me, kid. I'll take you out to play," she said, extending her hand toward me. I shook my head desperately, stepping back further. She cursed under her breath and ignored me after that. "Where are you going?" I asked as she turned around, suddenly bending over with a groan. "You don't need to worry about it," she muttered, her neck twisting oddly. "Why does my hair feel like it's being pulled?" I froze, my blood running cold, when I noticed a chubby, pale hand emerging from her neck, as though it were some twisted network of veins like dried up leaves. I looked up in horror. There was Tiểu Nguyên again, his heavy form draped over her back, his grin wide and unsettling. One hand held her hair tightly, while the other pressed his finger to his lips, signaling me to be silent. But something didn't sit right. Tiểu Nguyên face was unscathed, yet the woman's hand, just moments ago, had been dripping wet. The woman seemed entirely oblivious to this, casually walking down the street. After a few steps, she twisted her neck again, as if the movement were nothing. "No matter where you go, I can always find you," I suddenly heard a whisper in my ear. It was Tiểu Nguyên voice. I hadn't gone home yet. I stayed where I was until the break of dawn, my legs too weak to move. When morning came and I returned home, I was scolded severely. My grandmother and mother were terrified, but thankfully nothing had happened to me, so everything seemed to be over. Not long after, I heard that the police had arrived, holding a wanted poster as they searched for Tiểu Nguyên mother, or, more accurately, the woman we had encountered. "Who exactly is that woman?" I asked my mother. "That woman is a human trafficker. She specializes in trafficking young children, about your age. She tricks them into gathering together, then takes them to rural areas to sell. There was one time when the driver fell asleep at the wheel at night and the truck crashed into a river. All the children drowned, and their bodies weren't found until days later. When they were recovered, their heads were swollen like buns, and the veins on their foreheads were bulging. More than a dozen children. Their lips were blue, their eyes swollen shut, and their bodies were soaked through like white radishes. That day, the police told everyone about the incident, and that's when we all learned how evil that woman truly was. She even has children of her own, yet she does such monstrous things. Unfortunately, they haven't been able to catch her yet," my mother said, explaining angrily. "Tiểu Nguyên isn't her son," I suddenly said. My mother looked at me, confused, but then continued, "Forget about her. The police said that before she was exposed, she had already trafficked another child, and she often carried him around with her. She probably wanted to adopt him as her own son. She's done so many terrible things. Maybe she can't even have children of her own anymore," she said, scolding again. After that, my mother quickly went to handle her business. Later, we went to my grandmother's house, but someone else had moved in. The woman was nowhere to be found. Over time, I heard neighbors gossiping, saying they had seen a frail woman with a large-headed son in another area. But they were never caught. It was as if the two of them were playing a game of hide-and-seek with the police. Then I began having the same dream repeatedly. In my dream, I saw a group of children playing hide-and-seek. They were laughing and hiding, but only one child stood facing the wall, resting his head on his arm as he counted. I happily approached, wanting to join them. Suddenly the child turned his head. He had no eyes, just empty, blood-soaked sockets, with his eyelids and forehead tightly pulled, creating deep, grooved wrinkles. That face was Tiểu Nguyên. In my dream, I was so terrified that I stepped back one step at a time. The children who had been hiding suddenly emerged from their hiding spots, slowly walking toward me. They were all Tiểu Nguyên, each with the same large, swollen head, squinted eyes, purple lips, and damp, bloated bodies. "Come play hide-and-seek with us!" they all called in unison, their voices innocent and cheerful. I woke up with a start, drenched in sweat. I suddenly understood why that woman could never escape from Tiểu Nguyên,